Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Kroc School. We're so happy to have you here. The Kroc School is a global hub for peace building and social innovation. I am Andrew Blum, Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice here at the Kroc School. We like to say the Kroc IPJ is the bridge between theory and practice at the Kroc School. The core of the Institute's mission is to learn with those working to build more peaceful societies, both locally and globally. And in doing so, we drive forward the Kroc School's mission to empower and equip the next generation of peacemakers. And what better way to do this than to hear directly from change makers who have been in the trenches trying to create a more peaceful world. This is why I'm so excited we have Rick Wayman with us here today. Rick has been a true leader, a true change maker in the global effort to abolish nuclear weapons, weapons that remain the single most dangerous technology that humans have invented. He played a leading role in advancing the lawsuits filed by the Republic of the Marshall Islands against all 9 nuclear-armed nations, leading to a movement among smaller nations to challenge the status quo in regard to nuclear weapons. He was also a member of the team of negotiators at the United Nations in 2017 that led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and a Nobel Peace Prize for the international campaign against nuclear weapons, which he played a role in founding. In a moment, I'm going to ask Rick to come to the stage to talk to us both about his efforts to abolish nuclear weapons, but as well as the recent nuclear diplomacy we've seen play out in the news. After that, I will invite Dr. Vidya Nadkarni to the stage to moderate a Q&A, and we'd really like you to start thinking about your questions for Rick so we can have a really robust Q&A. Dr. Nadkarni is a professor of political science here at the University of San Diego. She received her PhD from the University of British Columbia. She's an expert on great power diplomacy, Chinese foreign policy, and Russian foreign policy. Her books include The Foreign Policy of Russia and Challenge and Change: Global Threats and the State in the 21st Century. So you can see she is well positioned to help us think through the issue of nuclear weapons in this rapidly changing global context. Finally, I'd like to thank Corinne Goria, an accomplished lawyer, writer, and also an instructor in our political science department, for all she did in helping make tonight happen. So now please help me in welcoming Rick Wayman to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here this evening. I want to thank the University of San Diego and the staff of the Kroc Institute for your work to put this event together. Special thanks, of course, to Dr. Blum, Dr. Nadkarni, and Corinne Goria for all of your work in bringing me here tonight. And I also want to thank all of you for being here, because it's not easy to think about nuclear weapons without being terrified or feeling helpless. So I'm grateful for your presence. This is an issue that is going to require all of you in order for us to solve this. So what I'll be talking about tonight is the era that we're living in right now. And I think that it is perhaps the most dangerous time, but I believe strongly that it is the most hopeful time. So I'll be talking about a few different things that are my reasons for believing that. But to start out, I want to talk a little bit about the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. What is this organization? What does our name even mean? And why am I here talking about this issue tonight? So first, about our name, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. The idea is that peace is an imperative of the nuclear age. As long as nuclear weapons exist, any conflict has the potential to spiral into nuclear weapons use. So that's why, as we work to get rid of all nuclear weapons worldwide, we also must be working for peace to make sure that they're never used. The organization was founded in 1982. We're based in Santa Barbara, California, and we have about 80,000 members worldwide. Most of them are here in the United States. We work to educate and advocate for peace and a world free of nuclear weapons. We have consultative status to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. And that's one of the reasons why I had the privilege of being involved in the negotiations at the UN in 2017. As Dr. Blum said, we were a founding partner organization of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. So tonight I'll be talking about dangers and hopes around nuclear weapons. I always like to end with hope, so I'm going to start with a couple of the very serious dangers that we're facing in the world right now. And the first is the nuclear arms race. That is something that we might think happened during the Cold War and when the Soviet Union fell, arms race over. Not the case. The US right now is in the midst of spending $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize, to do what they call modernize its nuclear arsenal. This is the nuclear warheads, the delivery systems, so the submarines, the airplanes, the missiles, and also the production infrastructure. And it's important to note that this is not just a Trump administration thing. This plan came about under the Obama administration. President Trump's nuclear posture review is perhaps more transparent about the aggressive nature of US nuclear policy, and it actually also introduced some new proposals for new nuclear weapons that will undoubtedly make that price tag go even higher. So as I say here, this plan, we're gonna be spending over $100,000 per minute, every minute, for the next 30 years on nuclear weapons. That's not okay in my book, but it's important to note that it's not just about the money. There are other reasons why that is dangerous. And one thing is that this is a cycle. There are 9 nuclear-armed countries in the world: the US, Russia, UK, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. All 9 of these countries are engaged in one form or another of modernizing or increasing their nuclear arsenals. So money, opportunity costs with that money, absolutely, that's an issue. But the production and the testing and the use of nuclear weapons have unimaginable and wholly unacceptable humanitarian and environmental consequences. So there are currently about 14,500 nuclear weapons in the world. About 90% of those are in the arsenals of the US and Russia. So that number has gone down substantially. There were many tens of thousands more during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period. The quantity has been going down. But what's happening right now in this new nuclear arms race, it's not a quantitative nuclear arms race per se. We're not trying to build more. We're not trying to get thousands and thousands more of these weapons. But what's happening is a qualitative nuclear arms race. Countries are racing to develop new capabilities and evade the defenses that other countries are developing. So Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty requires all parties to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. It's worth noting this treaty has been in effect for 49 years. So there's that ambiguous phrase, at an early date, that is involved in this legal obligation. I find it hard to believe that that countries that signed on to this envisioned a half a century counting as at an early date. So we are pushing absolutely for this to happen and for it to happen very soon. So disarmament through the Non-Proliferation Treaty is stalled, and also only 5 countries out of the 9 nuclear-armed nations are party to that treaty. So something else needs to happen, and I'm going to get to that in our hopeful part. But before I do that, one more big danger that we're facing right now, and that is the issue of North Korea. So as we all know, there have been 2 high-profile summits between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and thus far, there have not been any significant commitments that have come out of that, or formal commitments that have come out of that. We have gone from threats of fire and fury to an exchange of love letters. So, you know, that maybe there's some progress there, but it's really important to note that while the tone of rhetoric has changed, the policies and the postures of both countries remain the same, and that could allow for a huge escalation at any moment. So there were moderate expectations that at the Hanoi summit, some sort of agreement would be reached. And instead, the summit ended early. So what went wrong? I only have a few minutes to talk about this, so I'm only going to talk about a couple things that went wrong. But first of all, U.S. officials initially claimed that the summit collapsed when North Korea demanded that the U.S. lift all sanctions against it. It was later revealed that North Korea's request was for all sanctions imposed over the past 2.5, 3 years to be lifted in exchange for irreversibly shutting its Yongbyon nuclear complex. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, also at the Hanoi summit, substantially moved the goalposts on what was actually being negotiated. His demand during the Hanoi summit was that North Korea not only dismantle its nuclear weapons program, but also its ballistic missile program, its chemical weapons program, and its biological weapons program. There are valid reasons to want North Korea to get rid of all of those programs, but like I said, that is moving the goalposts in a serious way and in an unexpected way. So that's a big reason why the summit collapsed. While I'm on the topic of John Bolton, he is largely responsible for U.S. violation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, also U.S. suspension and withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia, and like I said, unexpectedly dropped into Hanoi to derail any possible progress with North Korea. It was John Bolton, in fact, who prior to the Singapore summit, the first summit between Trump and Kim, who raised the specter of the Libya model in dealing with North Korea. So if we give Bolton the benefit of the doubt, he could have been referring to the agreement that was reached with Gaddafi in 2003 to end Libya's nascent nuclear weapons program. However, after Bolton brought up this Libya model, President Trump and Vice President Pence were more overt in their descriptions of what the Libya model means. Trump said, "We went in and decimated Gaddafi, and we did the same thing with Iraq. That model would take place if we don't make a deal, most likely." And Pence said, "This will only end like the Libya model ended if Kim Jong-un doesn't make a deal." So they're very overt about what they meant by the Libya model. Now, Cho Sun-hui, who's a North Korean vice foreign minister, after Pence made those comments, she called him a political dummy and said, "In order not to follow in Libya's footstep, we paid a heavy price to build up our powerful and reliable strength." So North Korea clearly sees their nuclear weapons program as the insurance policy for the regime. And when they hear the Libya model, they are not thinking a sweet 2003 deal with Gaddafi. They are thinking NATO bombing and subsequent killing of Gaddafi. That's how they view it. So what are North Korea's capabilities? We hear a lot that they can hit Los Angeles now with a nuclear weapon. So we know that they have produced enough fissile material to build perhaps 30 or 60 nuclear weapons, and they may have assembled 10 or 20 at this point. It remains uncertain whether North Korea has demonstrated an ability to actually develop a functioning reentry vehicle to deliver an operational nuclear warhead. Remember, these intercontinental ballistic missiles, they go into outer space and have to re-enter the atmosphere. That's a very robust process, and we're not quite sure whether or not they have that capability at the moment. But North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear weapon test explosions and numerous missile tests of varying ranges. So there's a lot to be concerned about in the situation between the US and North Korea, but there are also reasons to have hope. And the first thing, first of all, this image here is the Korean unification flag. You may have seen that in the 2018 Winter Olympics when North Korea and South Korean athletes marched together under the one Korean flag. I believe that not nearly enough attention is being paid in the US and in the US media to the inter-Korean peace process. That's a primary issue that brought Moon Jae-in to power in South Korea a couple of years ago. So the Korean War never officially ended. An armistice agreement was signed in 1953, but that was never followed up by any kind of official declaration or peace treaty. So as we know, that was 65 years ago, over 65 years ago. But there's a real possibility that such a declaration will be one of the next steps taken. And I think it's really important, if we're serious about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, I think that a peace declaration, a peace treaty, is the logical next step and an essential next step. It's unreasonable, I think, to expect North Korea to get rid of its nuclear weapons while it is still technically at war. One other very important reason for hope around the North Korean situation is that there are very strong moves to get women seats at the table in these negotiations. I'm very pleased to learn about the Kroc Institute's efforts in the Women Waging Peace program. My friend Christine An, who's a Korean-American woman, is co-founder of an organization called Women Cross DMZ, and she's been working tirelessly to make peace happen in this instance. What she says and what I read in the literature that's out on the tables in the lobby is that when women are included in peace processes, it often leads to a peace agreement, and not just an agreement, but a durable peace agreement. And that's a really important point. So I'm happy to see that work happening here, and I'm very hopeful that it is in progress as relates to the US-North Korea conflict. A couple of other hopeful things to talk about. The treaty, the new treaty called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This was negotiated in 2017 at the United Nations. And this was a culmination of a few years of countries and civil society organizations organizing international conferences to highlight the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. So in July of 2017, 122 nations voted to adopt the new treaty, and only one nation, the Netherlands, voted against it. The 9 nuclear-armed nations and the NATO allies, with the exception of the Netherlands, chose to boycott the negotiations, despite that well-established norm that I talked about earlier in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that requires good faith negotiations for nuclear disarmament. This process was a good faith negotiation for nuclear disarmament, and we were disappointed that more countries chose not to take part. But for me, I think the most notable thing about this treaty was that there was a deep level of involvement by civil society. And so this was organizations like mine, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, humanitarian organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, and very importantly, voices of people who have been directly impacted by nuclear weapons, such as the woman we see here, Setsuko Thurlow, who is a survivor of the Hiroshima atomic bombing, and next to her, Sue Coleman-Hasseldine, who was impacted by the United Kingdom's nuclear weapon tests in Australia. So typically at UN events, civil society gets a few seats in the back of the room, and if we're lucky, we can wrangle one or two ambassadors during the lunch break and talk to them about our opinions. And that was not the case at all in the case of in negotiating this treaty. We were given opportunities each day to deliver comments from the floor, just like any of the country representatives. And in many instances, countries were relying on civil society for our expertise on these issues, and we were pleased to see our advice followed. One example, my colleague at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Sarah Whitmer, who's here tonight, Sarah, she wrote a working paper from the negotiations that called for inclusion of a prohibition on the threat of use of nuclear weapons. That prohibition was not in the initial drafts of the treaty, but it did end up in the final text. So that was one very tangible way that we were able to impact and make a difference in history. And I think that's really exciting. Just a little tangent here for the students who are in the audience. So Sarah is now our Director of Development. She's been working with us full-time for about a year and a half. But when she wrote that working paper for the UN, she was an intern. And I just want to say to the students here, I really encourage you to find meaningful internships that will give you big responsibilities and that will allow you to really develop your skill sets and to make a difference in the world. There are organizations out there that do that. And you can change the world now. You don't have to wait until some time in the future when you're an established professional. You can do it right now. Yeah, indeed. So from the name of the treaty, you would imagine there are some prohibitions. There are some things that are prohibited around nuclear weapons. So you can't threaten to use nuclear weapons, like I mentioned. There are some obvious prohibitions. You can't develop nuclear weapons. You can't deploy them. You can't use them. There are also prohibitions against assistance, which can include financial assistance. So this is going to put companies that produce nuclear weapons and the financial institutions that finance those companies in a precarious position once this treaty enters into force. So I encourage you to check out a report called Don't Bank on the Bomb. It's at don'tbankonthebomb.com. You can see a list of companies that are involved in nuclear weapons production and a list of the banks that finance them. So take a look at that list, and is your checking account with one of those banks? And if it is, how do you feel about that? And what are you going to do about it? It's a personal decision. It involves some work if you choose to get out of that relationship. But it's important to know what's happening with your money, what corporations are doing with your money. So in addition to the prohibitions that are in the treaty, there are also positive obligations, what they call positive obligations. And these are things such as a minimum of IAEA safeguards, victim assistance and environmental remediation for places that were affected by nuclear weapons and people who were affected by nuclear weapons, and also to provide age and gender-sensitive assistance, including medical care, rehabilitation, and psychological support for those affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons. And I believe that NGO involvement was 100% responsible for getting these positive obligations included. Without the compelling research and testimony from people around the world, I don't think that states would have made that a priority. but there it is in the treaty. And one more very hopeful thing to talk about, of course, is the Nobel Peace Prize. So in 2017, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. So as I mentioned, my group, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, was part of ICAN from its inception in 2007. The network has now grown to over 500 organizations, 500 partner organizations in over 100 countries. I don't know how well you can see that photo, but it is representative of our campaign. There's a lot of diversity in our campaign. Like I said, over 100 countries. There are people of all ages, all abilities. There are people who have been directly impacted by nuclear weapons. There are people who can't explain to you the physics of how a nuclear weapon works. But we all have a passion for getting rid of these weapons, and all of us are not going to stop until we fully achieve that mission. But one of the biggest reasons, I think, for our success as an international campaign has been shifting the narrative on nuclear weapons from theoretical things like deterrence and military strategy to the very real and tangible humanitarian consequences. So when I was 23, I attended an event at which two survivors of the Hiroshima atomic bombing described their experiences. I was deeply, deeply moved, and I knew that I had to do something. I had to be involved in making a change. So the voices of survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of people impacted by nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands, Australia, Kazakhstan, right next door to us in Nevada, they tell an unmistakable story about what nuclear weapons do and what they're designed to do. So the Nobel Peace Prize has opened a lot of doors for us as a campaign and for us as individual campaigners. I had the honor of meeting Pope Francis in late 2017 at the Vatican when he advanced Catholic teaching against nuclear weapons, stating that the threat of using nuclear weapons, as well as their very possession, is to be firmly condemned. So those of you who follow Catholic teaching closely or more closely than others might recognize that word condemned. It has a very strong meaning. And I think it's really important that Pope Francis has advanced that, not only to talk about possessing them, but also threatening to use nuclear weapons. That's a new, groundbreaking, and I think is going to make a real difference. So what's next? As of today, relating to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as of today, 22 countries have ratified the treaty. The treaty will enter into force 90 days after the 50th country ratifies it. So obviously every country has a different process to ratify international treaties. This is moving forward. There have been over 70 countries that have signed the treaty at this point, and all of them are moving at different speeds and with different levels of urgency to achieve that ratification. But I'm hopeful and confident that we will reach 50 within the next year and a half. The most recent country to ratify the treaty is South Africa. And South Africa had nuclear weapons in the 80s. They had about 6 or so nuclear weapons. They chose to no longer be a nuclear-armed country, and they're now, in fact, a leader in this effort to get rid of nuclear weapons worldwide. So I mentioned earlier that nuclear-armed countries chose to boycott negotiations of this new treaty. The U.S., under both Obama and Trump, has been aggressively hostile to the treaty. But it doesn't mean that we're just going to sit back and hope that there's a new administration and maybe they'll be more amenable. That's not what we're doing. We're taking action now. And one of the things that we're doing is working with cities and states around the U.S. to build momentum, to pass resolutions calling on the national government to embrace the treaty and to make nuclear disarmament the centerpiece of national security policy. So last year, the state of California and the city of Los Angeles passed resolutions like this. So that's us with one of the LA City Council members who introduced this resolution and the Nobel Peace Prize. We got to drop in on City Hall in October of last year with the Peace Prize and reward them for a job well done. It's really important that cities like LA, California, the biggest state in the nation, and a trendsetter have passed these resolutions. So just a couple of weeks ago, Washington, D.C. passed a resolution. One just got introduced in Hawaii, and there are many more in the works. So we're building up momentum. While we're not able to make real progress nationally with the federal government at the moment, we are making very meaningful progress with cities and with states. So if you're interested in putting a resolution together for your city, get in touch with me. I have my cards on one of the tables out in the lobby, and I'm easy to find online as well. So if you want to do this here in San Diego or whatever city you live in, let me know and let's do it. We can actually make this happen, and we are making this happen. We also have many other opportunities for you to promote legislation in Congress. Our website, wagingpeace.org/act, has all of those opportunities. There are a number of bills in Congress right now. We're not at the point in Congress where they're ready to talk about abolishing all nuclear weapons, but they are ready to talk about stopping new nuclear weapons from being developed. They're ready to talk about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty being important and something that should be preserved. Those are all essential steps. We've always got to keep our eye on that end goal of zero nuclear weapons, but we can't forget that there are very real things happening right now that we need our members of Congress, our senators, our representatives to pay attention to and to act on. So I'm going to close out my prepared remarks right now. There's a little bit of contact info here. Our website, of course, wagingpeace.org, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Check out what we're doing online. Join us. Share this information with your friends. And let us know what we can do in your community to make a difference, because we are making a difference, and we can. We need people like all of you in this room to step up and do it. We'll be right there with you. So thank you all very much, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rick, for that very thoughtful and succinct account of the challenge of nuclear weapons around the world. And I was particularly struck by the themes you chose of danger and hope. If you have read about it, certainly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the members of Kennedy's ExComm staff used those very words to describe what was happening at the time. You know, they were teetering between danger and hope. So I'll take the liberty as moderator to start with a few questions and then invite audience participation. One of the things as you were talking, and you alluded to this, I think, very briefly, the reasons why North Korea has decided to be a nuclear weapons power. In order to understand our points of leverage, whether it's states or citizens or civil society, we have to have some sense of why they have decided to embark on a nuclear weapons program and how one might best allay these concerns. Certainly, reference to the Libya model isn't going to help. But is concern over the notion of regime change the only motivating factor for the North Korean nuclear weapons program?
Well, that is a great question. And I think that it is likely the top motivator, regime change. But I don't believe it's the only one. And I think we don't need to look farther than some of the other nuclear-armed countries to figure out what else might be going on. There's an idea that nuclear weapons give a country prestige. Who are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council? They are all nuclear armed. And so what example does that set? You know, it means if you want to have a voice, if you want to be powerful and influential, you need these magical weapons. And so I think that's definitely one thing. Also, just in general, the idea not only of preventing regime change, but also this theory of nuclear deterrence. You know, so that's not only about regime change, but also, you know, kind of a wider theory of preventing someone from attacking you. You know, the idea that nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantee against being attacked. It's very difficult to prove the theory of nuclear deterrence, that it works. There has not been an instance in which a nuclear-armed nation has been attacked or hit with a nuclear weapon in 70-plus years, but that's the blink of an eye in terms of human history. And there have been plenty of periods in human history where there has not been a great power war for 70 years. So I think that it's extremely dangerous for countries to believe in that and believe that this record of non-use of nuclear weapons will last forever. But I think that is an influence on countries like North Korea that have developed them.
And not just North Korea, certainly the Indian subcontinent is another example. So I'm not going to take up too many questions on North Korea or nuclear weapons because I'm sure there are other people in the audience who will carry this conversation further. I did want to take the piece of hope as well. So, you know, one question for danger and one question for hope. In terms of the treaty to abolish nuclear weapons and the various articles you have there, does it include any enforcement mechanism?
The idea is that this will be developed over time. So the first, and this is sort of a process that has played out in prohibiting other classes of weapons, like chemical, biological, landmines, et cetera. So it's not set, and they purposely did not set that because essentially that would be another excuse for countries not to sign on. The idea is to get this treaty to enter into force, to establish a new norm, to increase the taboo of possessing the weapon. And as this norm develops over the next few years, and as we can get into having review conferences around how the treaty is progressing, then we can get into how to actually enforce it. But first, we've got to prohibit the weapon because right now there's that level of prestige and influence that they're still giving. And so that was our idea, was to try to undercut that, make the nuclear-armed countries, hopefully put some pressure on them to rethink their stance. But yes, ultimately, we'll need to get into enforcement down the road. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll open it up now to audience participation so that we have plenty of time. Yes, ma'am?
Why the United States Could you comment on what you think the reason is that the United States withdrew from the INF Treaty?
Sure. So the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, was a bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Soviet Union that carried over into the U.S. and Russia. So it was in effect for over 30 years. The stated reason is that Russia developed and deployed a missile that violated that treaty. So I think that that is one reason why the US withdrew, is that they were upset about that and they claimed that this was their only recourse, was to withdraw. I think that probably China was another issue that was high on the agenda. This was a bilateral treaty between the US and Russia, but some of the US's major competitors, China chief amongst them, were not bound by the limits of this treaty. And so there was whether it's perceived or real, some advantage that China had that the US and Russia did not have because they were limited by the treaty. I think those were probably the two main reasons, but I talked maybe a little too much, maybe, about John Bolton tonight, but he is an arch enemy of treaties, of international treaties, of anything that could possibly restrict a U.S. projection of power and force. So he's in charge right now. He's the national security advisor. And that's a really dangerous thing. I think he's given some bad advice.
A few things I should have mentioned is, would you please identify yourself? And the first question, I think, was the model. Keep your questions short. Yes, way back there.
Sorry, video.
Oh,
Rick, could it be that MAD, mutual assured destruction, is the reason why the 9 countries that can do that could blow up the world, doesn't want to give up that power? Your thoughts. Thank you.
It could be. I mean, I think that what underlies that theory is what I was talking about earlier, deterrence. You know, believing that because we have this power, it will never happen because it's too awful to ever actually happen. So yeah, I think that in the minds of some or many people who are making these decisions in the nuclear armed countries, I think that that's perhaps the case. But it's also, I think, really important to realize that when we talk about mutual assured destruction, we often think about that in the context of the US and Russia and the thousands of nuclear weapons that each country possesses. And if those were used, we would all be destroyed. But there have been some recent climate studies that have shown that a very small number, relatively small number of relatively small nuclear weapons, in the case of, say, India and Pakistan, could cause what is called nuclear famine. It would block out sunlight for about a decade, putting about 2 billion people around the world at risk of starvation. And so that study was 50 nuclear weapons on each side, and those were roughly Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons that would do that level of damage. So when we're talking about mutual assured destruction, I think it's important for us to realize that it's not just that US-Russia thing. I mean, India and Pakistan almost went into full-fledged war a couple weeks ago. And I would imagine a lot of people in this room are aware of that. But if we were to survey the city of San Diego and its population, very few people, I think, would know about that. And both of those countries are nuclear armed, and that's something that is totally outside of our control, that situation. Yet it would drastically impact all of us around the planet. So mutually assured destruction is, I think, a really terrifying concept, and one that absolutely involves all 9 of the nuclear armed countries, not just the US and Russia.
Yes. I'd like to ask if you can talk about the Stockpile Stewardship Program and how much money has already been allotted to that. My name is Gail Jacobson. I'm concerned about this because it seems like there are billions of dollars over like a 10-year period that is going to be allotted. And one of the results could be the development of a smaller, potent nuclear weapon. I was wondering if you could address that and what we can do to try to stop this. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for that question, Gail. So the Stockpile Stewardship Program is where the U.S. is essentially trying to keep their existing nuclear weapons in what they would call working order. Sometimes they talk about making sure that their nuclear weapons are safe, secure, and reliable, safe, secure, and effective. And they do that by, well, essentially, or theoretically anyway, swapping